Saxon going with the Monster energy drink. All right. But our game plan for today, we're going to try to wrap up World War II and wrap up Unit 3 as best as we can. This will include kind of looking at how did World War II come to an end, but then also we'll take some time to discuss the events and the buildup of the Holocaust, which was going on throughout World War II. So, vocabulary here on the left. As you're jotting that down, taking a moment to think about, why study the conclusion of World War II and the Holocaust? Oh, nice, Lily. One, I think one of the events we're going to talk about today is America's decision to drop 2 atomic bombs on Japan, which I think is a good example of the challenging situations leaders, such as presidents, oftentimes find themselves in when there's no good solution, when inevitably any decision you're going to make is going to have consequences. How do you wrestle with that then? And real quick to the question about the war clouds checkpoint. Again, whenever those checkpoints are asking you for a code word, it's in the lesson itself. So you want to make sure you fully work through the lesson and the lesson activities to find those code words. 2, as we spend some time also talking about the Holocaust, the argument there is, yes, this is a very horrible, uncomfortable piece of history to look at, but it's also important to study it so that hopefully we do not repeat those same mistakes, that we see how did the Holocaust develop over time, ultimately leading to the mass execution of Jewish people as well as other minority groups, so that hopefully we can prevent something from like that happening again. And yeah, Lincoln, we'll get into that. So that will definitely tie into the student question about the decisions to drop the atomic bombs. Some other things to note. You won't have a weekly reflection assignment this week because as part of wrapping up Unit 3, you will either need to turn in your Unit 3 study guide, or if you've been taking your own unit notes, you can turn that in as well. Again, reminder also daily extra credit for participating in class. All right, so with that, let's go ahead and get started. So as I mentioned, we're not going to spend a whole lot of time talking about the actual military events of World War II. And Lincoln, off the top of my head, I couldn't say. You can always check your grade book. I'm about halfway through them. Then probably the answer is no, it hasn't. But one event we do want to at least briefly mention is American participation in D-Day. So as noted previously, President Roosevelt viewed Hitler and Nazi Germany as ultimately being the bigger threat to world peace. And so in the aftermath of the Pearl Harbor attacks, the United States greatly expanded its involvement in the war in Europe. That included, as part of Lend-Lease, sending massive amounts of supplies, vehicles, weaponry over to Europe as part of this long-term plan to eventually invade Nazi-held Europe and to eliminate the Nazi Empire. And so that took years of planning and getting everything together. But ultimately, the invasion is carried out on June 6, 1944, what is known as D-Day, or the invasion of Normandy, which, if any of you have ever seen the movie Saving Private Ryan, is what that whole opening battle is depicting, where soldiers had to be transported in these transport ships that would then try to get as close as they could to the coastline. But ultimately, soldiers then having to jump out into the beaches, which were heavily defended by Nazi forces on top of these cliffs. Incredibly difficult battle situation. That ultimately, high numbers of casualties. Ultimately, 5 beaches were attacked simultaneously by American forces, British forces, Canadian forces, under the hopes that at least one would be successful and we would get a foothold and be able to start pushing back into Europe from there. Operations led by General Dwight D. Eisenhower. Ultimately, the operation is successful, and this is kind of viewed as the beginning of the end of the war in Europe. From here on out, Allied forces will continuously be pushing Nazi forces back. And so D-Day is ultimately celebrated in American history of one of the sacrifices that American soldiers made to win World War II, but then also the beginning of the process of freeing Europe from Nazi rule. That would still take time, but eventually Allied forces will move into Germany from multiple directions. As things are kind of closing in on Hitler, he ultimately then makes the decision to commit suicide rather than face the consequences of his actions. During the war, we also have the United States working on a new project, the development of an atomic bomb, which, if any of you have seen the movie Oppenheimer, that is, what that movie is all about. And even before the United States was actually in World War II, this project was begun, what's known as the Manhattan Project, out of fears that the Nazis were working on developing an atomic bomb, a bomb that would harness the power within atoms, the building blocks of all matter, a bomb that would ultimately be much more destructive than any weapon that was currently in existence. And so out of fear that, well, we don't want the Nazis to have that weapon first and, them to have that advantage, America started working on it. And yes, Christian, yes, famously Oppenheimer's words after the detonation of the first atomic bomb. So the Manhattan Project was this secret national project that had facilities around the United States where people were working on one piece of the project without really knowing what they were fully working on. Secrecy was of huge concern, as the one sign outside of one of the Manhattan Project facilities indicates. And hey, Madison, glad you can make it. With ultimately the first atomic bomb successfully detonated in July of 1945 out in the Southwest deserts, which some scientists had concerns. Some scientists raised concerns that the amount of heat and energy released from an atomic explosion might be enough to trigger a chain reaction to ignite the atmosphere, which luckily did not happen, but it's kind of a scary concern that some people had, and did it anyway. But by this point in time, President Roosevelt had died. He ran for re-election in 1944, wins, but at that point he really shouldn't have. After 12 years of being president, it had really done a number on his health, and so he dies shortly into his fourth term as office. Shortly after that, Hitler commits suicide and dies as well, but we still had the war in Japan going on. And so when Roosevelt dies, his vice president, Harry Truman, takes over. And just to kind of indicate how top secret the Manhattan Project was, Truman was unaware of this project until he became president. And then people are like, oh, well, I guess now that you're president, you should probably know, we're working on building an atomic bomb, and we're really close to success. So after the first bomb was successfully detonated, Truman now has this choice on, do we use it or not? The war with Japan was still going on. In the summer of 1945, Japan did not seem like it was going to call it quits anytime soon. And so the original plan was basically we were going to have to do another D-Day. We were going to have to do another full-blown invasion of Japan and take it, step by step like we did Europe. But now that we also have this atomic bomb in our arsenal, do we use that instead? A bomb that is capable of, wiping out an entire city in one explosion. So President Truman had to make a very difficult decision of what direction would the United States go with in trying to end the war with Japan. And so what potentially might have been some of the reasons Truman considered using this new destructive weapon? And yes, as Lincoln notes, a number of the most talented scientists in Germany were Jewish, and so when Germany commits the crimes of the Holocaust, persecuting the Jewish people, it ultimately robs itself of a lot of talent, including nuclear physicists. And so, yes, ultimately the Nazis abandoned the project and focused on the development of jet engines instead. So what do we think? What potentially might be some arguments in favor of dropping the atomic bomb? Lincoln mentioned one earlier at the start of class, is that an argument was made that it potentially could save lives. That if we use the atomic bombs instead of a full-blown invasion, that would ultimately reduce American casualties. That it potentially might also save Japanese lives as well. There was a concern of there being intense Japanese resistance, including among Japanese civilians, that ultimately lives would be saved by avoiding a full-blown invasion. Because yes, under the fascist ideology that ruled Japan at the time, Japanese soldiers were told, you do not surrender, you fight until the bitter end. You try to take some enemies down with you, that surrendering was dishonorable. So there was a concern that that any sort of invasion of Japan would be a bloody affair. What ultimately will be another argument and major consideration for Truman's decision is wanting to display this new American power to other countries, specifically the Soviet Union. Because while technically America and the Soviet Union are allies during World War II, we are also rivals, as America embraces capitalism, Soviet Union embraces communism. And so wanting to kind of demonstrate the power of this new weapon to the Soviet Union also factor into things. There was also this desire to want to end the war very quickly before the Soviet Union could claim too much territory in Asia, as it was now fighting and pushing back the Japanese. Yes, exactly, Lincoln. I know, Megan, it's always good when we learn new things. So those were some of the arguments in favor of using the atomic bomb against Japan. And then, yes, as Lincoln notes, nowadays the emperor is largely a kind of a symbolic position. That Japan has a prime minister that does more of the active governing work today. And then Megan, I'm not sure what that's in reference to. What then might potentially be some of the negatives if Japan decides to use, or excuse me, what might be some of the negatives if Truman decides to use the atomic bomb against Japan? Yes, one is that, dropping these bombs, especially on cities, is going to result in a lot of death. A nuclear bomb does not discriminate. It destroys everything. So that will include any military targets, but it's also going to include any civilian structures that are caught in the blast radius. So that's going to mean the destruction of people's businesses and homes, schools, hospitals. It also, yes, releases massive amounts of radiation, which then creates, if exposed to water and land, is going to contaminate that with radiation, preventing those areas from being livable for an extended period of time. Any person that is exposed to radiation, in somewhat smaller doses, significantly increases the chances of developing cancer down the road. If exposed to large amounts of radiation, results in radiation sickness, which is ultimately probably one of the worst ways a person can die, and just an incredibly painful experience, as essentially your body's cells are breaking down, from the inside out. And then, yes, the loss of culture, any historical artifacts or landmarks or places of cultural significance are going to be wiped out by the blast. And so, yeah, to Megan's comment that, there are going to be, people that kind of have that frustration, that you have these incredibly destructive wars because you have, individual leaders who are, wanting to build empires. But then it's, everyday people that are, really going to, face the consequences of that. But yes, as Lincoln mentioned, one of the reasons why ultimately Truman makes the decision to drop the bombs was this concern of the number of casualties of a invasion of Japan. You had, for example, things like the kamikaze pilots, Japanese pilots that if their plane was going down, rather than try to crash land and survive, they were trained to crash their aircraft into enemy forces as kind of a final act of self-sacrifice. Or because the Japanese government and military had told Japanese civilians that you don't want to surrender to the United States. They're brutal, they're cannibals. We have multiple cases of Japanese civilians who would commit suicide rather than risk being captured by the United States because they had been told these horror stories of what American soldiers would do to them. And so, to Lincoln's comments, this is dramatically going to reshape Japanese culture. So ultimately, the decision is made to drop 2 atomic bombs on Japan, the cities of Hiroshima and then Nagasaki, as a way of trying to more quickly end World War II. Now, there were some who argued for a third path of saying, well, okay, we understand, the whole land invasion thing, that's probably going to be messy, but what if we did like a test display of the atomic bomb for the Japanese? What if we dropped an atomic bomb on an uninhabited island and we allowed Japanese forces to like witness it and then be like, see, this is what we got. Do you really want us to start dropping these on your cities? As kind of an effort of a peaceful demonstration of the atomic bomb before forcefully using it. But ultimately, that option was denied. And so the first bomb is dropped on Hiroshima on August 6th. Japan does not immediately surrender after that first bomb is dropped, in part due to some miscommunications. And so the decision is then made to drop the second bomb on Nagasaki, at which point Japan does unconditionally surrender to the United States, which ultimately kind of worked out because we only had 2 bombs at that point in time, and it would have taken us time to build more. And so that will bring officially an end to World War II, but at a terrible cost. These bombs will completely wipe out the city centers of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. For those people that are not immediately killed in the explosions, they are exposed to toxic levels of radiation and will either die in the days and weeks following due to things like radiation burns, radiation sickness. Others will develop cancer down the road and die from that. And there's something kind of, hauntingly symbolic about it. But here you can see, for example, the city center prior to the detonation of the bomb, and then the aftermath that basically the entire city is erased. The heat and energy from the bombs is so intense that it literally burns shadows of objects and people into walls. Here you can see one of the more mild examples of a person suffering from radiation burns and radiation sickness. Didn't want to include anything too gratuitous, but it is an incredibly horrific way for someone to suffer and ultimately pass away. And so that will ultimately have to be one of the things for the United States to wrestle with. There was a lack of understanding of just how much of an impact the radiation from an atomic bomb would unleash. I mean, ultimately, a lot of Americans will also die from radiation exposure in the building and the development of atomic bombs. Because to this day, the United States is still the only country to use atomic bombs against people. It does ultimately bring World War II to an end, but kind of at a terrible cost. But ultimately, the ending of World War II is largely celebrated in the United States, because after years of being involved in the largest war in human history, things were coming to an end. And as we will see as we get into next unit, this will kind of be the beginning of a golden age for the United States. America largely avoided the destruction of World War II. The American economy is operating at full strength by the end of World War II. And so while America will experience some of its best years in the aftermath of World War II, the same is not true for most of the rest of the world. Which absolutely, Megan, it's not to imply that America did not make any sacrifices. Somewhere over 400,000 Americans lost their lives over the course of World War II. But then you look at how that compares to some other countries. You look at the millions of casualties in the Soviet Union. And we also can then look at, in blue, the number of civilian casualties as well. So much of World War II was, the destruction of enemy cities, like Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And so we can also just see the millions of people who were not, active military participants, but were destroyed by the war anyway. Ultimately, World War II, the most destructive, the deadliest war in human history. And so for most of the world, or much of the world, the years following World War II will be painful ones of rebuilding and trying to, put back together what had been utterly destroyed by the war. And then, yes, Christian, some great observations there. And again, much of this is due to the brutality of the Japanese invasion of China and the lack of concern for civilian casualties. And Megan, not sure what you mean by that. I mean, ultimately, Germany does lose both wars, but in both cases, Germany, to a certain extent, was operating by itself and having to fight a war in multiple directions against multiple opponents, and very much holding its own. Up until the United States got involved in World War II, it very much seemed at the time that Germany was going to win this thing. But yes, one of the things Germany will have to reconcile with after the elimination and of Hitler and Nazism is, how did we let this happen? How did things get so far out of control? And so one of the things that Germany will really embrace is teaching the history of, hey, future generations of Germans need to know how this happened, how things went so wrong, so that hopefully, we never make these same mistakes again. And part of that is, going to be laws to try to eliminate the reemergence of fascism within Germany. So to wrap up World War II, both Germany and Japan will unconditionally surrender, which will allow the Allied powers to go into both countries and restructure them the way we want to. We'll hopefully get to talk a little bit more about that next unit, but basically the United States will go into both countries and help rebuild them as peaceful democracies and ultimately as allies of the United States. As part of the United States now embracing the role of being a world leader, one of the lessons America will learn here is like, oh, we can't just ignore what happens in other parts of the world. That can really come back to bite us and allow problems to kind of snowball out of control. So America will now kind of embrace this role of being a world leader. Doesn't mean we're always going to get it right. As we will see next unit, we are going to, in some cases, go too far in the other direction and get too involved in things and arguably make some situations worse. But this will also see the United States trying to create new global organizations to try to help maintain world peace. Things like the United Nations, the International Monetary Fund, the World Bank. That will also receive some criticisms, as not every country is in an economic situation to just compete with the economy of the United States. And so there will be a lot of countries, especially in South America, Africa, and Asia, that will kind of resent being forced to embrace free trade capitalism when they're not necessarily economically ready to compete with countries like the United States. But the other major topic of World War II we need to discuss is the Holocaust. The Nazi systematic mass persecution and slaughter of Europe's Jewish population, as well as other minority groups during World War II. The Nazis will also try to eliminate people with physical and mental handicaps. The Romani people, sometimes also known as gypsies at the time, members of the LGBTQ community, anything that Hitler and the Nazis identified as being outside of their narrow definition of what it meant to be part of German society was potentially identified as a target. Which will ultimately result in the deaths of at least 11 million people. What you see here is a French memorial recognizing the victims of the Holocaust, and this is just a small portion of a much big memorial, but just to try to give you a sense of the number of casualties. This will include approximately 2/3 of Europe's Jewish population being wiped out. And to Lincoln's comment, yes, this unfortunately has become an even more important piece of history to talk about, as unfortunately due to things like the internet and social media, we are seeing a rise in people denying the events of the Holocaust, arguing that it never happened, that it's all just like some big conspiracy theory. Which like is one of those things I personally can't even wrap my mind around, of like, how would you even go about faking something like that back in the 1940s? How do you explain the disappearance of 2/3 of Europe's Jewish population? But it has unfortunately become a growing perspective, especially among young people. Young people in America today are by far the most likely to at least somewhat agree with claims that the Holocaust never happened. So I want to be upfront. It did. We have countless pieces of evidence documenting it. Again, I try not to be overly graphic in this class, but I will share some of it with you. And I think one of the important things to note with the Holocaust is how it developed over time. Again, if on day one Hitler had come out and said, I want to execute all the Jewish people, that probably would have been viewed as so extreme that his rise to power would have been shut down. And so I think what's kind of important about understanding the Holocaust is how it built up over time. And so it began simply with messages of anti-Semitism, messages criticizing or attacking the Jewish people. Again, Hitler's common argument was that the Jewish people are responsible for Germany's problems. The Jewish people take too much and they give too little. They are a burden on Germany. Now, as we've already previously mentioned, in many ways, Jewish people actively contributed to the growth and development of Germany. But again, that it's easy to pick a minority group because they don't have the numbers to defend themselves and say, those people are the problem. If we could just get rid of that one minority group of people, that would free up more resources, more land, more opportunities for everyone else. And so we even see that message being printed in children's books, like you see here, which, of course, why would the Nazis do that? Why would you maybe try to spread anti-Semitism to children? Which ultimately, yeah, humanity is complicated. History is a collection of both terrible and incredibly beautiful things. I think sometimes it can become easy to just want to, look at all the negative and go like, oh, this is just like bleak. But we should also keep in mind the beautiful things that humans have done throughout history and the way people have helped one another throughout history. But yes, very much that idea of let's essentially brainwash people while they're young. If we can get children to embrace this anti-Semitic message at a young age, they will be more primed to accept anti-Jewish persecution as adults. So then through the 1930s, as Hitler and the Nazis gained power, one of the first things they did was to try to control media and control popular culture, which excellent comparison, Lincoln, yes. This included putting together a list of banned books that people were encouraged to round up, collect, and then have these community book burnings like you see here. This oftentimes included works written by Jewish authors. The Nazi Party will also take over practically all of the media in Germany, newspapers, radio stations, movie studios. Which, of course, why might Hitler view it as being so important to control the available media and information within Germany? Right, to keep people in line with the party viewpoint, to ensure nothing spreads that challenges the Nazi viewpoint. Again, this is a defining element of fascism, is being intolerant of any sort of opposition or alternative viewpoints. And so Hitler very aggressively using the power of government to shut down any form of popular expression that might challenge his viewpoint. So that means wiping out Jewish contributions to German culture by, burning their books, taking over any newspapers or radio stations that are criticizing Nazi activity. And yes, absolutely. As Lincoln notes, this is ultimately a playbook that unfortunately a lot of other totalitarian governments will follow, such as in China, Cuba, especially North Korea. Because then, right, exactly, Megan, if you eliminate any sort of discussion of the positive contributions of Jewish people, or just any sort of discussion of like, hey, these are fellow human beings, like they should be treated with decency, that of course then just leaves the Nazi viewpoint out there in public culture, criticizing and demonizing the Jewish people. And hey, Israel, glad you're able to make it back. So then in 1938, we have what's known as Kristallnacht, which is German for the Night of German Glass. Of course, one of the tactics of the Nazis is whenever a Jewish person did commit a crime, a spotlight was shined on that of like, see, we told you these people are violent, these people are dangerous. Now that, of course, is ignoring the fact that the vast majority of Jewish people were peaceful, law-abiding citizens. But part of the propaganda machine is anytime you do find an example that kind of lines up with your viewpoint, you shine a spotlight on it. And so when a German government official was assassinated by a teenage Jewish person, the Nazi propaganda machine went into overdrive of, see, look at this, we told you, it's really the Jewish people that are the violent ones. They're the ones, attacking innocent Nazis. This cannot stand. The German people should rise up against this. And so on November 9th into November 10th, you have the Night of Broken Glass, where mobs of people throughout Germany attacked Jewish communities, broke the store windows of Jewish-owned businesses, hence the name the Night of Broken Glass, attacked Jewish synagogues, places of worship. And in the aftermath of this, the Nazi government will argue that this was a spontaneous response to outrage, that Hitler and the Nazi government had nothing to do with this. Hitler never went on the radio and gave an order of like, go attack Jewish businesses on this night. He's going to claim deniability. But in reality, what the government did do is it sent messages in nudging people towards this, of saying, hey, we understand a lot of people are really upset about this assassination. If people were so upset that, they maybe, had public demonstrations, maybe some things got out of control, we would understand that. We would not, prosecute anyone that, was so upset about the situation that, maybe there was some, destruction of private property, for example, which of course is going to be a message understood by local Nazi leaders of, oh, we have the green light, from the Nazi party to carry out these acts of violence, that, the government's not going to stop us, that local police are not going to stop us. And so, yeah, Megan, to your comment, yes. Part of it was that you had a level of anti-Semitism in Austria and Germany to begin with that Hitler would have grown up with. Part of it is kind of the story we see with how a lot of people get converted into extremist philosophies. As a young man, Hitler had a loss of a sense of identity, a lack of a sense of belonging. He found acceptance within the growing Nazi party within Germany. That unfortunately he ended up finding, he had a lot of talents in spreading the Nazi viewpoint, and that allowed him to rise up within the Nazi party. And it's kind of one of those things that, it's almost like a cult, in the sense of like, once you're kind of in that community and you're constantly being bombarded with this message of those people are the problem, those people need to go in order for things to be better for the rest of us. If that's the message that your community is constantly bombarding you with, it gets ingrained. Most people don't have the mental capacity to challenge that. That is one of kind of the great what ifs of history. If Hitler had been accepted into art school, how different would history be? It's hard to say for sure. Maybe Hitler does find a group of friends and a sense of community at art school, and never ends up seeing the need to join the Nazi party instead. One of those things we'll never know for sure. And hey, Shayla, make sure to check out the recording later for what you missed. That I could not comment on, So after Kristallnacht, after the Night of Broken Glass, Hitler's then going to be able to say, well, clearly things are they're not safe for people. Clearly the Jewish people and the rest of the German population cannot coexist with one another. It's really just going to be better for everyone if we separate the Jewish people from the rest of the German population. And so we have the creation of ghettos, where sections of cities were walled off, and then all of the Jewish people were put into these ghettos. Which you're going to have a number of people who kind of accept that argument of like, yeah, things do seem like they're getting kind of intense, kind of violent. Maybe it really is just better for everyone if we separate the Jewish people from everyone else. Like, arguably it's for their safety too. They will no longer, be subject to mob attacks. But of course, in reality, this is not for the safety of the Jewish people, because once you socially isolate them from the larger population, that makes them even easier targets. It's now going to be even easier for the Nazis to do what they want with them, because you've now separated them from mainstream society. And so then from there, you eventually have the building of the concentration camps, where the Jewish people will be reassigned, loaded up into trains like you see here, oftentimes in brutal traveling conditions. When they got to the concentration camps, they were basically stripped of their identity. Instead of going by names, they were given numbers that were often tattooed on their arms. Their personal belongings were taken away from them. Oftentimes the Nazis would then use their belongings to help fuel the war effort. Here you see a warehouse of the collection of shoes taken from them. At these concentration camps, then they would be forced to work in brutal conditions with little food, lack of sleep. Here's the entrance to one of the camps, with the famous slogan in German that work shall set you free, which is ultimately a very ominous message when you consider the final reality of the Holocaust. Here's an example of one of the bunkers that the prisoners had to sleep in. You can get a sense of the poor living conditions, the lack of food that these people received. Again, while the Jews were the primary target of the Holocaust, they were by no means the only ones. One of the first victims of Nazi rule were people with mental and physical handicaps, because Hitler viewed them as being a contamination of the German gene pool, that they had to be eliminated. And so families were lied to, told that their family members with handicaps were going to be taken to special facilities to get the care that they needed. They were not. They were executed, with oftentimes these families never knowing, at first what actually happened to them. Political opponents were also targets of the Holocaust, people that embraced far left viewpoints like communism. various religious groups like Jehovah's Witnesses were also targeted because they're not practicing the right version of Christianity. Again, members of the LGBTQ community were also targeted because they are not conforming to the Nazi view of society. Again, we talk about how fascism dehumanizes people. It strips people of their humanity. And so that then kind of opened up the door for Nazi experimentation on victims of the Holocaust. Doing incredibly unethical things like twin studies of exposing one twin to a fatal disease or torturing one twin to see, like, would the other twin respond? But of course, ultimately, the end goal of the Holocaust was genocide, the mass execution of an entire group of people, what Hitler called the final solution. And so you have things like these gas chambers for the mass execution of victims of the Holocaust. Bodies were then either disposed in mass graves like you see here, or burned in crematoriums. Here's ultimately a photo of American soldiers liberating one of the Holocaust camps. But then here you can see the numbers of ultimately the total victims of the Holocaust. But I see we're out of time, so we will end there for today. If you have any questions or want more information, stick around and let me know. Otherwise, you are good to go, and hope you enjoy the rest of your day. Thanks, Ryan. You too. See you, Lily. Bye, Lincoln. You too, Olivia. See ya.